She walked away in tears. The Alpha King didn't realize it was goodbye forever. Why did she walk away in tears? And why did the Alpha King not realize it was goodbye forever? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy emotional werewolf romances filled with unforgettable choices, heartfelt moments, and powerful twists, you are in the perfect place. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Thank you for your incredible support and for being part of this growing community. Now, tell us in the comments, do you think people always recognize the value of someone before it is too late? With that thought in mind, let us step into a story where every farewell carries more weight than anyone could have imagined. The people who leave without looking back are often the ones who hoped someone would ask them to stay. The grand hall of Ashen Crown Palace shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lanterns suspended from towering cedar beams, their warm light reflecting across polished marble floors that had witnessed generations of Alpha Kings making decisions that shaped the fate of every pack in the Northern Territories. Elegant orchestras filled the air with gentle strings while nobles dressed in embroidered velvet exchanged quiet laughter beneath banners stitched with silver wolves. Servants moved gracefully between long banquet tables carrying silver trays filled with roasted pheasant, fresh mountain berries, warm bread, and sparkling cider poured into crystal goblets imported from kingdoms beyond the Eastern Sea. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, another perfect royal gathering where alliances strengthened and appearances mattered more than hidden feelings. King Nathaniel Ashcroft stood at the center of the great hall surrounded by council members, visiting alphas, and respected elders who eagerly sought his attention. At 34 years old, he carried the quiet confidence of a ruler admired for his wisdom, discipline, and calm judgment. His tailored black ceremonial jacket embroidered with silver thread rested perfectly against his broad frame, while the royal crest pinned across his chest caught the soft glow of candlelight whenever he turned toward another guest. Every conversation demanded his attention, every greeting required a measured smile, and every decision seemed to pull him farther from the quieter corners of the palace. Near the far end of the ballroom, almost hidden behind a marble column wrapped with climbing white roses, Clara Whitmore stood holding a neatly folded stack of documents she had spent weeks preparing for the Royal Council. Her midnight blue dress was simple compared to the jeweled gowns worn by noblewomen surrounding her, yet its understated elegance suited her gentle nature perfectly. Soft chestnut hair rested against her shoulders, and her pale blue eyes reflected the dancing lights across the ballroom without sharing in the celebration surrounding her. For nearly 7 years she had quietly served inside the palace archives, organizing treaties, preserving ancient records, preparing speeches, correcting diplomatic correspondence, and solving countless problems before anyone else even realized they existed. Most members of the court recognized her face but rarely remembered her name. She had become part of the palace itself, dependable as the sunrise, invisible as the walls. Clara looked toward Nathaniel one last time. He was smiling politely at another delegation arriving from the Western Mountains, thanking them for generous gifts and discussing preparations for the approaching Winter Council. She waited for only a few more seconds, hoping his eyes might wander across the crowded hall. They never did. A quiet breath escaped her lips, carrying with it weeks of unspoken disappointment she had carefully hidden behind patient smiles. Without bitterness and without anger, she gently placed the carefully prepared documents upon a nearby oak table where his personal secretary would easily find them the following morning. Beside the papers rested a small silver palace badge bearing the royal crest, the symbol every senior palace servant received after years of loyal service. Clara slowly removed it from her dress and laid it beside the documents. The tiny piece of silver made almost no sound as it touched polished wood, yet somehow the silence that followed felt heavier than the orchestra playing only yards away. She reached into her pocket and lightly brushed her fingers across a folded envelope sealed with dark blue wax. After a brief hesitation, she slipped it back inside instead of leaving it behind. Some words were never meant to be read. Gathering only a small travel bag that contained little more than a warm cloak, a journal, and a family photograph faded with time, Clara quietly walked toward the palace doors. No guard stopped her. No noble noticed her passing. Only an elderly palace gardener arranging winter flowers beneath the entrance arch happened to glance up as she stepped outside into the cool autumn evening. He watched the young woman pause beneath the enormous stone archway before silent tears finally escaped down her cheeks. She never looked back. The old gardener lowered his head, removing his weathered cap with quiet respect, though he could not have explained why his heart suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Inside the palace, laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers as the celebration continued exactly as planned, and King Nathaniel Ashcroft never realized that the quiet footsteps disappearing beyond the palace gates had just carried away someone whose absence would one day change everything. The palace celebrated long after midnight, but the quietest departure left the deepest mark. By the time the final musicians packed away their instruments and the last visiting nobles retired to luxurious guest chambers, Clara Whitmore had already traveled several miles beyond the royal walls. The moon hung high above the winding forest road, casting soft silver light across fallen maple leaves that crunched gently beneath her boots. A cool autumn breeze tugged at the edge of her gray traveling cloak, carrying with it the familiar scent of cedar and distant rain. She tightened her grip around the worn leather strap of her small satchel and continued walking without once looking behind her. Every step carried 7 years of memories she had tried to convince herself no longer mattered. She remembered arriving at Ashen Crown Palace. As a young Omega barely 20 years old, nervous enough to stumble over her own words during her first meeting with the Royal Archives. She had possessed no noble family name, no wealth, and no influence. What she did have was remarkable patience, an extraordinary memory, and a quiet determination to make herself useful wherever she could. At first she repaired damaged scrolls, organized forgotten treaties, and copied handwritten records until her fingers ached late into the evening. Months slowly became years. Whenever the palace faced a diplomatic misunderstanding, Clara found the missing document. Whenever visiting ambassadors required forgotten customs explained, Clara quietly placed the correct records on the appropriate desk before sunrise. She remembered nights spent rewriting speeches after sudden political changes, mornings helping frightened young servants prepare for important ceremonies, afternoons comforting nervous messengers who feared disappointing the king, and countless evenings ensuring every council meeting unfolded smoothly long before anyone entered the chamber. She never expected recognition. She simply believed that if everyone else succeeded, then her work had been worthwhile. Somewhere along those quiet years, her respect for King Nathaniel had quietly grown into something far more personal. Not because he was an alpha king, but because she had watched him carry the impossible weight of an entire kingdom with honesty and dignity. She admired the kindness he showed frightened children during public festivals, the patience he offered elderly villagers during open court, and the steady calm he maintained even when difficult decisions rested upon his shoulders. She had never asked for his affection. She only hoped, perhaps foolishly, that one day he might truly see her as more than another dependable member of the palace staff. Earlier that evening, while standing unnoticed beside the marble column, Clara realized that day was never coming. Nathaniel had not ignored her out of cruelty. That somehow hurt even more. He simply had so many responsibilities that someone who quietly solved problems without asking for attention had gradually disappeared into the background of his life. She could not blame him, yet she could no longer remain where her heart quietly broke a little more with each passing season. Ahead, a modest roadside inn appeared beneath the glow of 2 hanging lanterns swaying gently above the entrance. Clara stepped inside, grateful for warmth after the long walk through the cooling night. The elderly innkeeper welcomed her with a kind smile and prepared a simple room overlooking rolling hills painted silver beneath the moon. After placing her satchel beside the small wooden bed, Clara finally removed the folded envelope she had carried throughout the evening. Breaking the dark blue wax seal, she unfolded several neatly written pages. It was a farewell letter addressed to Nathaniel. She read every word silently before tears blurred the careful handwriting she had rewritten countless times over the previous month. After a long moment, she slowly folded the pages again instead of leaving them with tomorrow's outgoing mail. Some goodbyes did not need explanations. Some were simply acts of mercy. As dawn approached beyond the quiet hills, Clara placed the unopened letter back inside her satchel, unaware that inside Ashen Crown Palace, Her empty chair in the royal archives would greet the morning long before anyone realized she was truly gone. The absence of one quiet person rarely announced itself all at once. It revealed itself through the countless little things everyone had forgotten she was doing. Morning sunlight spilled across the stained glass windows of Ashen Crown Palace, painting long ribbons of gold and crimson across the marble corridors as servants hurried to prepare for another busy day inside the royal residence. The celebration from the previous evening had barely ended before another full schedule demanded the attention of every department. Royal messengers carried sealed invitations toward the council chamber, visiting ambassadors requested revised travel itineraries, and palace attendants arranged fresh flowers throughout the audience hall before the first official meeting began. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. At least, that was what everyone believed. King Nathaniel Ashcroft entered the royal council chamber precisely at 8 o'clock, greeting ministers with his usual composed smile before taking his seat at the head of the long oak table. As always, he reached toward the neatly organized stack of briefing documents waiting beside his chair. His hand paused. The papers were there, but something felt strangely different. The reports had been assembled correctly, yet several reference maps were missing, and 2 diplomatic letters had not been translated into the neighboring Alpha dialect as they normally would have been before sunrise. Nathaniel frowned only briefly before assuming someone had simply forgotten an assignment after the previous night's festivities. "We will continue," he said calmly, believing the oversight too small to mention. Across the table, Lord Harrison Cole searched through his own folder with growing confusion. "Your Majesty," he said politely, "the historical trade agreements with East Hollow are not included." Another advisor quietly added, "Neither are last year's harvest comparisons." Nathaniel looked toward his chief secretary, who appeared equally puzzled. "I believe those were prepared yesterday." The secretary glanced down at the incomplete files before answering carefully. "They usually are." No one spoke Clara's name. They simply moved on, accepting minor inconvenience as part of palace life. Meanwhile, inside the royal archives, shelves stretching 3 stories high remained perfectly silent except for the gentle sound of pages turning. Clara's empty desk stood neatly arranged exactly as she had left it. Every ink bottle had been sealed. Every quill rested parallel to the edge of the wooden table. Every unfinished manuscript had been labeled with careful handwritten notes explaining what still required attention. Even her chair had been pushed neatly beneath the desk. Theodore Bennett, the elderly chief archivist who had supervised Clara since her first day at the palace, stopped beside her workspace and remained there longer than usual. He noticed the royal badge missing from its usual place on the corner shelf. He noticed the ledger containing yesterday's completed work had already been filed. Then his eyes settled upon a single handwritten envelope resting beneath a polished paperweight. It was not addressed to the king. It simply read, "For whoever continues this work." Theodore slowly opened the envelope. Inside he found detailed instructions explaining where every important record had been stored, which restoration projects required immediate attention, and which diplomatic files would be needed over the next several months. The final sentence was written smaller than the rest. "Everything should continue smoothly. No one should be inconvenienced because I was here." Theodore quietly lowered the letter. He had spent 40 years training archivists, yet he had never known anyone who cared so deeply about making life easier for others without expecting gratitude in return. Looking around the enormous archive, he suddenly realized the room felt far larger than it had only yesterday. Back inside the council chamber, Nathaniel listened to another delayed report while unconsciously glancing toward the doorway, expecting someone to quietly appear carrying the missing documents just as had happened so many times before. The door remained closed. For reasons he could not explain, the room suddenly felt just a little less complete. The smallest routines often carried the greatest weight, especially after the person who created them quietly disappeared. 3 days passed, and Ashen Crown Palace continued moving forward with all the precision expected of the kingdom's heart. Courtiers attended meetings, servants polished endless marble corridors, and royal guards changed shifts with practiced discipline. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Yet beneath the polished surface, tiny cracks had begun spreading through the daily rhythm that had once felt effortless. Requests that normally reached the correct department before breakfast now wandered through 3 different offices before noon. Visiting ambassadors waited an extra hour for historical records that had always seemed to appear almost magically on the conference table. The palace kitchens received banquet schedules too late to prepare specialty meals requested by honored guests. None of the delays were disastrous. They were simply unusual. Nathaniel noticed each one with growing curiosity rather than frustration. During an afternoon strategy meeting, he quietly asked his chief secretary, "Have we hired someone to replace Miss Whitmore yet?" The secretary hesitated before answering. "No, Your Majesty. We believed she had only taken personal leave. We expected her to return after a few days." Nathaniel gave a thoughtful nod. "She has earned the rest if she needs it." His answer sounded calm, yet a faint feeling of uncertainty settled somewhere beneath the words. He realized he could not remember anyone mentioning exactly when Clara planned to return. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel crossed the eastern corridor leading toward the royal archives, intending only to retrieve an old map before the evening council. The familiar scent of cedar shelves and aged parchment greeted him as he stepped inside. Theodore Bennett welcomed the king respectfully before leading him toward the requested records. As they walked between towering bookcases, Nathaniel's eyes wandered almost instinctively toward Clara's desk. It remained perfectly organized. Fresh flowers in a small ceramic vase had begun to wilt slightly, their petals curling gently along the edges. A half-finished restoration brush rested exactly where she had left it. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked as though its owner had simply stepped away for a moment. Nathaniel slowed without realizing it. "She always kept this place remarkably orderly," he observed. Theodore smiled softly. "She believed that leaving confusion for someone else was a form of unnecessary kindness." Nathaniel ran his fingertips lightly across the polished edge of the desk. "She has always been dependable." Theodore looked at him carefully before replying. "More dependable than most people ever realized." The old archivist wanted to say more. He wanted to explain how Clara often stayed late into the night repairing damaged records after everyone else had gone home. He wanted to mention the mornings she quietly corrected council reports before sunrise so younger assistants would never be embarrassed by innocent mistakes. He wanted to describe the countless times she accepted responsibility for problems she had quietly solved before anyone noticed they existed. Instead, he remained silent. Some truths carried greater weight when discovered rather than explained. As Nathaniel prepared to leave, something caught his attention on the corner of Clara's desk. A small glass jar held dozens of neatly sharpened pencils arranged by length. Beside it rested a handwritten note attached with simple blue ribbon. It read, "Please use these before opening the new box. Waste less whenever possible." Nathaniel smiled almost unconsciously. It was such an ordinary reminder, yet it reflected exactly the thoughtful person who had written it. Walking back through the quiet corridor, he found himself remembering little moments he had never considered important before. A cup of warm tea appearing beside his desk during long winter meetings. Corrected speeches waiting before dawn. Historical references prepared before he even requested them. None of those memories had seemed remarkable at the time. Together, however, they formed the outline of someone whose presence had quietly become woven into every ordinary day. For the first time since Clara's departure, Nathaniel asked himself a question that refused to leave his thoughts. Had he truly known the woman who had spent 7 years making his kingdom run more smoothly, or had he only known the work she quietly left behind? Sometimes the first sign that someone mattered was not the silence they left behind, but the voice they had chosen never to use. 5 days after Clara's departure, the autumn rain settled gently over Ashen Crown Palace, covering rooftops, stone courtyards, and towering cedar trees with a quiet silver mist. Nathaniel stood inside his private study reviewing reports delayed by another series of small administrative mistakes. Nothing was severe enough to threaten the kingdom, yet every page seemed to carry another missing detail, another overlooked appointment, or another forgotten historical reference. It was as though the palace had slowly lost an invisible rhythm no one knew how to replace. A respectful knock interrupted his thoughts. Theodore Bennett entered carrying a slim leather folder tucked beneath one arm. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "while reorganizing the archives, I found something I believe belongs to you." Nathaniel accepted the folder with quiet curiosity. It contained no royal seal, no classified documents, and no diplomatic correspondence. Instead, inside rested a single folded sheet written entirely in Clara's familiar handwriting. The page was dated nearly 8 months earlier. At the top she had written only one sentence. "Observations for future improvements." Nathaniel unfolded it slowly. What followed surprised him. There were no personal requests. No complaints. No mention of promotions or recognition. Instead, Clara had carefully listed practical suggestions that would make life easier for palace servants, traveling ambassadors, elderly visitors, and junior archivists. She recommended wider handrails along the western staircase because older guests often struggled during winter. She suggested creating duplicate copies of important treaties so younger assistants would not panic if an original became damaged. She proposed placing drinking water inside waiting halls for villagers who traveled long distances seeking royal hearings. Each idea was thoughtful, specific, and completely focused on helping someone else. Nathaniel continued reading until he reached the final paragraph. "The palace already serves the kingdom well. I simply hope that one day it may also become a place where every person, regardless of title, feels genuinely seen." Nathaniel lowered the paper without speaking. He realized Clara had never written those words for herself. They reflected the way she quietly viewed everyone around her. Theodore remained respectfully silent until the king finally asked, "Why was this never presented?" The elderly archivist answered honestly. "She asked me not to. She said the council already had too many responsibilities and these could wait until a more convenient time." Nathaniel looked back at the handwritten pages. Even her ideas had been willing to wait behind everyone else's needs. Later that afternoon, unable to concentrate, Nathaniel left the palace alone and walked through the royal gardens despite the light rain. Fallen leaves floated across shallow pools while stone pathways glistened beneath the gray sky. Near the eastern greenhouse he noticed old Samuel, the palace gardener who had cared for the grounds longer than Nathaniel had worn the crown. The elderly man smiled warmly as he trimmed late autumn roses. "The flowers seem quieter this week," Nathaniel observed absent-mindedly. Samuel paused before replying. "Miss Whitmore used to stop here every Tuesday morning on her way to the archives." Nathaniel looked at him with quiet surprise. "She did?" Samuel nodded. "She always carried a small pouch of wildflower seeds. Said the empty corners deserved color too." The gardener gently pointed toward a narrow flower bed blooming unexpectedly with pale blue blossoms despite the season. "She planted those last spring. She said someone walking alone might need something beautiful to notice." Nathaniel stood silently before the flowers as rain collected on delicate petals that refused to bow beneath the weight of the water. He suddenly understood something that unsettled him far more than missing reports or delayed meetings. Clara had quietly left pieces of kindness throughout the entire palace, touching lives in ways no official record would ever capture. And somehow, despite seeing her almost every day for 7 years, he had never truly stopped long enough to notice the woman who had been gently changing his kingdom one thoughtful act at a time. The truth rarely arrived through a single revelation. It revealed itself one grateful voice at a time. The following morning, Nathaniel decided to spend several hours walking through parts of the palace he had not visited without ceremony in years. Leaving behind his formal escort, he exchanged his royal cloak for a simple dark coat that drew little attention from servants busy with their daily responsibilities. The palace looked different at this slower pace. Instead of hurried meetings and official announcements, he noticed quiet conversations echoing through sunlit corridors, the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting from the kitchens, and the soft scratching of quills inside offices where clerks organized endless stacks of records. Near the eastern wing, He paused outside the messenger station where dozens of young couriers sorted sealed letters bound for villages across the Northern Territories. One nervous apprentice accidentally dropped an entire bundle of documents across the stone floor. Before Nathaniel could step forward to help, the supervising messenger sighed gently and smiled. "Do not worry," he said. "Miss Whitmore always reminded us that papers can be gathered much faster than confidence can be rebuilt." The young apprentice laughed with relief and carefully collected every page. Nathaniel remained silent. It was another lesson carrying Clara's quiet kindness, still living inside people who repeated her words without even realizing it. As he continued walking, he entered the palace infirmary where elderly healer Margaret Ellis organized shelves filled with herbs, clean bandages, and glass bottles containing carefully labeled remedies. She greeted the king warmly before mentioning that the supply inventory had become unusually difficult to manage over the past week. "Miss Whitmore used to visit every Friday evening," Margaret explained while arranging dried lavender into small linen bags. "She never had medical training, but she always checked our records to make certain we would not run out of medicine during harsh winters. She said people should never have to worry about paperwork when they were already worried about someone they loved." Nathaniel quietly absorbed every word. No official report had ever mentioned Clara's visits to the infirmary. She had simply noticed a problem and solved it because she believed it was the right thing to do. Later that afternoon, he stopped near the palace kitchens where warm bread cooled on long wooden racks while cooks prepared meals for hundreds of residents and guests. Head cook Eleanor Brooks smiled respectfully before asking whether the king preferred rosemary or thyme with the evening roast. Nathaniel admitted he had no preference. Eleanor chuckled softly. Miss Whitmore always remembered. She opened a small notebook resting beside the preparation table. Every page contained careful observations written in Clara's familiar handwriting. Which ambassadors preferred lighter meals? Which elderly council members avoided certain spices? Which guards worked overnight shifts and appreciated hot soup before dawn? Clara had quietly learned hundreds of personal details simply to make other people's days a little easier. Nathaniel gently closed the notebook, overwhelmed by how much compassion could fit inside ordinary routines. As evening settled over Ashen Crown Palace, he climbed alone to the western balcony overlooking the entire kingdom. Golden light stretched across forests, rivers, and distant villages where families prepared supper beneath curling chimney smoke. The kingdom looked peaceful, yet for the first time since becoming Alpha King, Nathaniel questioned whether he had truly understood the people serving beside him every day. Clara had never asked for recognition. She had simply given pieces of herself wherever kindness was needed most. Standing beneath the quiet autumn sky, Nathaniel finally admitted a truth he could no longer avoid. He had spent years believing he understood loyalty because he inspired it. Only now did he realize that the strongest loyalty had been standing quietly beside him all along, and he had never truly seen it until the place she left behind became impossible to ignore. Sometimes a single forgotten object could reveal more about a person than years of ordinary conversation. Nearly a week had passed since Clara quietly left Ashen Crown Palace, and although the kingdom continued moving forward, Nathaniel found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing collection of small discoveries surrounding her absence. Every corridor seemed to carry another memory someone had quietly shared. Every department uncovered another thoughtful habit she had created without expecting anyone to notice. Yet the question that troubled him most remained painfully simple. Why had she left without saying goodbye? That afternoon, Theodore Bennett approached the king with a small wooden box wrapped carefully in faded blue cloth. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "our custodians found this." Hidden behind several historical ledgers while preparing Miss Whitmore's desk for the new archivist. "I believe you should see it before anyone else." Nathaniel accepted the box with quiet curiosity. It was remarkably ordinary, made from smooth maple wood polished by years of careful handling. Inside rested several simple keepsakes. A pressed white flower preserved between two pieces of parchment. A faded ribbon once used to organize council documents. A tiny carved wooden wolf no larger than the palm of a hand. Beneath them lay a neatly folded notebook bound in soft brown leather. Nathaniel opened it carefully, expecting official records or unfinished archive notes. Instead, he found short journal entries written over several years. None complained about long hours or difficult responsibilities. None spoke bitterly about palace life. Most pages contained simple observations about ordinary moments she hoped never to forget. One entry described a little boy laughing after receiving permission to tour the royal gardens. Another recorded how the first snowfall looked from the eastern library window. Another simply read, "His Majesty smiled today after the council approved the winter grain reserve." He looked relieved. "I hope he rests tonight." Nathaniel stopped reading. She had written about him often, but never in ways that sought anything for herself. She celebrated his successes quietly, worried about his burdens silently, and hoped for his happiness without expecting to become part of it. Turning another page, he found a date from almost 3 years earlier. Today he thanked everyone in the council chamber for their hard work. "I know he meant it sincerely. Even though he did not know I prepared most of the reports, hearing those words was enough." Nathaniel slowly lowered the notebook. A heavy silence settled inside the study. He searched his memory, trying to recall that meeting. He remembered thanking ministers, advisors, and senior officials after resolving a difficult border negotiation. He remembered the victory. He did not remember Clara standing quietly near the back of the chamber organizing documents while everyone applauded. Theodore remained respectfully near the window, giving the king space to absorb the pages in silence. After several long moments, Nathaniel asked quietly, "Did she ever speak about leaving?" Theodore shook his head. "Never directly. But during the past year, she occasionally asked whether a person could serve with all their heart while understanding they did not truly belong where they stood." Nathaniel closed the notebook and looked toward the palace gardens stretching beyond the tall windows. For the first time, he began to understand that Clara had not left because someone forced her away. She had left because she had quietly convinced herself that her presence or absence would make no meaningful difference to the one person whose opinion mattered most to her. The realization settled deeper than regret. It became something far more difficult to carry. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Clara continued walking toward a future she had never planned, completely unaware that the life she had left behind had finally begun asking the questions it should have asked long before she disappeared. The hardest truths were often waiting behind doors that had remained closed simply because no one thought to open them. 8 days after Clara's departure, Nathaniel found himself standing outside the modest room she had occupied inside the eastern residence wing reserved for senior palace staff. He had passed the door hundreds of times over the years without ever wondering what life looked like beyond it. Today, the polished brass handle seemed strangely unfamiliar beneath his fingertips. Theodore Bennett quietly unlocked the room before stepping back. "Nothing has been changed," he said softly. "The custodians believed it should remain exactly as she left it." Nathaniel entered slowly. The room was far smaller than he had imagined. Morning sunlight poured through a single tall window overlooking the palace gardens, filling the simple space with warm golden light. A neatly made bed rested against one wall beside a small wooden bookshelf containing history volumes, botanical guides, and several worn novels whose corners had softened from repeated reading. A writing desk stood beside the window with every pen carefully arranged, every sheet of parchment stacked evenly, and a tiny ceramic vase holding dried lavender gathered months earlier. There were no expensive decorations, no luxurious furnishings, and no unnecessary possessions. Everything reflected quiet purpose. Nathaniel walked toward the bookshelf where a framed sketch rested almost unnoticed between 2 old history books. It showed Ashen Crown Palace viewed from the eastern hill at sunrise. On the back Clara had written only one sentence. "Home is sometimes a place that never realizes you love it." Nathaniel stood motionless. The words carried no accusation. They simply carried acceptance. Theodore carefully opened the top drawer of Clara's desk. Inside rested dozens of small bundles tied with colored ribbon. Each contained handwritten notes labeled with names Nathaniel recognized. Young servants preparing for examinations. Garden apprentices learning seasonal planting. Junior archivists studying forgotten dialects. Clara had quietly assembled personalized study guides, encouragement letters, and practical advice for each of them. Theodore smiled gently. She believed people learned better when someone believed they could succeed. Nathaniel picked up one folded page addressed to a nervous palace messenger. It contained simple instructions on organizing deliveries followed by a final handwritten reminder. Everyone makes mistakes while learning. Keep walking. Tomorrow will be easier. He slowly returned it to its place. His attention then shifted toward a small oak chest tucked beneath the desk. Inside lay carefully wrapped keepsakes from 7 years inside the palace. A pressed autumn leaf collected during her first royal festival. A ribbon from a harvest celebration. A tiny silver bookmark awarded for restoring ancient manuscripts. Resting carefully beneath them all was an unopened invitation to the previous year's royal winter banquet. Nathaniel recognized the elegant seal immediately. He remembered approving the guest list personally. Theodore quietly explained she did attend. She carried the invitation home afterward because she said it was the first formal event where she felt included. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. Something so ordinary had meant so much to someone he had scarcely noticed standing quietly across crowded halls year after year. As he prepared to leave the room, his gaze settled upon one final object resting alone on the windowsill. It was a small glass jar filled with folded slips of paper. Curious, he opened one at random. In Clara's neat handwriting were the words, "Today an elderly visitor smiled after finding the document he feared was lost." Another read, "The kitchen staff laughed together during supper." Another simply said, "The king looked less tired today." Nathaniel opened several more. Every note recorded someone else's happiness. None mentioned her own. He gently closed the jar, understanding at last that Clara had measured the value of her days not by what she received, but by the quiet moments of joy she helped create for others. Standing inside the silent room, Nathaniel finally realized the greatest thing Clara had ever hidden from the palace was not her feelings. It was the extraordinary heart that had quietly loved an entire kingdom while asking almost nothing in return. The words people never intended to send often carried the deepest pieces of their hearts. That evening, after leaving Clara's quiet room, Nathaniel returned to his private study carrying only the small wooden journal and the glass jar filled with folded moments of kindness. He placed both gently upon his desk, but instead of opening them again, he found himself staring through the tall windows where twilight settled across Ashen Crown Palace in soft shades of blue and silver. The palace looked exactly as it always had. Lanterns illuminated the stone walkways. Guards changed shifts with practiced discipline. Servants hurried between kitchens and council chambers preparing for another ordinary evening. Yet everything now felt strangely unfamiliar because he had finally begun seeing the invisible hands that had quietly held so much of it together. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Theodore Bennett stepped inside carrying a single envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the innkeeper from Briar Hollow sent this earlier today." He believed it might belong to someone at the palace. Nathaniel accepted the envelope with careful hands. His heart recognized the handwriting before his eyes fully focused upon it. Clara had written his name across the front in the same neat script he had seen thousands of times upon reports, council summaries, and restored historical records. The wax seal, however, remained unbroken. Theodore explained quietly, "The innkeeper said she sat for nearly an hour holding this letter. The following morning she left before sunrise and accidentally forgot it inside her room. He assumed she intended to mail it, but there was no return address." Nathaniel waited until Theodore quietly left before breaking the seal. The pages unfolded slowly beneath his fingers. For several moments he simply looked at the familiar handwriting without reading, almost afraid the words might confirm what his heart had already begun to understand. Finally, he took a slow breath and started reading. Clara never accused him. She never blamed him for failing to notice her. Instead, she thanked him for allowing her to serve a kingdom she had grown to love. She wrote about the joy of restoring forgotten histories, watching children laugh during spring festivals, and seeing villages prosper beneath fair leadership. She admitted that leaving had been the hardest decision of her life, not because the work had become difficult, but because remaining beside someone who never truly saw her had slowly become a sadness she could no longer carry. One sentence made Nathaniel stop completely. "You never promised me anything, so I cannot fault you for breaking a promise that never existed." He closed his eyes. Those words contained no bitterness. They contained understanding. And somehow that mercy hurt far more than anger ever could have. He continued reading. Near the end of the letter Clara wrote, "Please do not search for me because of guilt. If you ever remember me, I hope it will be with a smile rather than regret. Some people are meant to leave quietly so the lives they touched may finally notice the silence." Nathaniel lowered the pages into his lap. The room remained perfectly still except for the quiet crackling of the fireplace. He suddenly understood why she had never left the letter behind. She had changed her mind because she wanted him to live freely rather than carry the weight of her goodbye. Yet fate had placed those words into his hands anyway. Rising slowly, Nathaniel walked toward the window overlooking the palace gates where Clara had disappeared only days earlier. For the first time since wearing the crown, he admitted aloud a truth no council, no title, and no victory could change. "I should have seen you while you were still here." Outside, the autumn wind stirred gently through the palace gardens, carrying away the final golden leaves of the season, while somewhere far beyond the distant hills, Clara continued walking toward a future she believed no longer included the home she had quietly loved with all her heart. The moment regret became action, it stopped being a feeling and became a promise. Dawn arrived beneath a pale gray sky as Nathaniel remained awake in the chair beside his study window, Clara's unopened farewell letter resting carefully upon the polished desk where he had read it countless times through the silent night. Every sentence echoed inside his thoughts with painful clarity, not because she had condemned him, but because she never had. Her kindness had spared him every accusation he deserved, and that mercy weighed heavier than any judgment ever could. As the first rays of sunlight touched the palace towers, Nathaniel folded the letter with careful hands and slipped it inside the inner pocket of his traveling coat. He rang the small brass bell resting upon his desk. Within moments, Theodore Bennett entered, immediately noticing the quiet determination replacing the uncertainty that had filled the king's expression over the previous week. Nathaniel looked directly at the elderly archivist before speaking with calm certainty. "Prepare my horse. I am leaving the palace today." Theodore studied him for a brief moment before asking the question already forming inside his own mind. "May I ask where your majesty intends to travel?" Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Wherever Clara's path leads." News of the king's unexpected departure spread quietly through the palace, though Nathaniel ordered that no grand escort accompany him. He refused ceremonial guards, royal banners, or elaborate processions that would announce his arrival in every village. Instead, he selected only one trusted captain to oversee the palace during his absence while Theodore gathered every record that might help trace Clara's journey after leaving Ashen Crown. The elderly innkeeper from Briar Hollow had remembered that she continued north shortly after sunrise, carrying only a modest satchel and declining every offer of transportation. Beyond that, no official reports existed. Clara had left no trail because she had never expected anyone to follow. Before riding through the palace gates, Nathaniel made one final stop inside the royal archives. Clara's desk remained exactly as she had left it. He placed a fresh bouquet of pale blue wildflowers beside the glass jar filled with folded memories before gently resting one hand upon the polished wood. The room remained perfectly silent, yet he found himself speaking anyway. "You spent years making certain everyone else felt seen. I cannot change the days I failed to see you. But I can choose what I do next." No answer came except the soft rustling of ancient pages stirred by the morning breeze drifting through an open window. Outside, Samuel the elderly gardener noticed the king crossing the courtyard with saddlebags secured behind his horse instead of royal luggage prepared for state visits. He smiled gently as Nathaniel approached. "Going somewhere important, Your Majesty?" Nathaniel returned the smile, though sadness lingered quietly within it. I believe I should have made this journey a long time ago. Samuel removed his weathered cap before offering one final piece of simple wisdom. When flowers disappear from the garden, most people search the empty ground. A wise gardener follows the sunlight instead. Nathaniel thanked the old man without fully understanding the meaning, yet the words remained with him as he guided his horse beyond the towering palace gates. Behind him, Ashen Crown Palace slowly disappeared beneath the morning mist that rolled gently across distant hills. Ahead stretched countless roads leading through forests, villages, mountain passes, and quiet valleys where Clara could have chosen to begin another life free from silent heartbreak. Nathaniel no longer traveled as a king searching for a loyal servant who had resigned. He traveled as a man hoping to find the one person who had quietly given him the greatest gift of all without ever asking for anything in return. And somewhere beyond the horizon, completely unaware that anyone had finally begun following the footsteps she believed no one would ever notice, Clara continued walking toward a future she had accepted alone. The road had a quiet way of revealing what the palace never could. For 6 days Nathaniel traveled through the northern territories without royal banners or formal announcements, stopping in small villages, roadside inns, and peaceful farming communities where few people recognized the Alpha King dressed in a simple dark traveling coat. Instead of issuing commands, he asked questions. Instead of expecting answers, he listened. Everywhere he stopped, Clara's name seemed to appear unexpectedly, woven into ordinary conversations like a familiar melody. At a village bakery overlooking a slow-moving river, the owner smiled warmly after hearing Nathaniel describe a young woman with chestnut hair and kind blue eyes. She repaired our accounting books after discovering we had been overpaying for grain deliveries, the elderly baker said while placing fresh bread onto cooling racks. She refused payment and simply asked us to donate extra loaves to families who needed them during winter. Nathaniel thanked the baker quietly before continuing north. Later that afternoon, he reached a one-room schoolhouse surrounded by maple trees glowing with brilliant shades of red and gold. Children laughed together outside while their teacher carefully erased chalk lessons from a weathered blackboard. The teacher recognized Clara's description immediately. She stayed here for 3 evenings, she recalled with a grateful smile. The roof leaked during heavy rain, and our history books had almost fallen apart. She spent hours repairing every page so the children would not lose them. Nathaniel stepped inside the small classroom. The books resting neatly upon the shelves had clearly been restored with patient hands. Along the inside cover of one history volume he noticed familiar handwriting. Knowledge grows best when it is shared with kindness. He gently traced the words with his fingertips before closing the book. Every mile he traveled seemed to uncover another quiet gift Clara had left behind. She had not escaped into loneliness. She had simply continued living exactly as she always had, helping people wherever her path happened to lead. On the 7th evening of his journey, Nathaniel arrived at a peaceful mountain village nestled beside a crystal-clear lake reflecting the golden light of sunset. As he guided his horse toward the modest village square, he noticed something unusual. Fresh flower boxes lined every cottage window despite the late autumn season. Elderly neighbors laughed together on shaded benches while children played safely between narrow stone paths. The entire village carried an atmosphere of warmth that felt strangely familiar. An elderly woman sitting outside a weaving shop looked up as Nathaniel approached. Before he could ask a question, she smiled knowingly. "You are looking for the young lady who always carries a small journal." Nathaniel's heartbeat quickened. "You have seen her?" The woman nodded. "She has been here almost a week. She teaches reading in the mornings, helps at the clinic during afternoons, and spends her evenings repairing books inside the chapel library." She pointed gently toward a small white building standing near the edge of the lake. Nathaniel followed her gaze. Through the open chapel windows, warm candlelight spilled softly into the cool evening air. Inside, seated beside a wooden table covered with weathered books, Clara carefully repaired torn pages while speaking quietly with 2 smiling children who listened to every word she read. Nathaniel remained completely still beneath the fading sunset. She looked peaceful. The sadness he had seen growing inside her during those final months at the palace had disappeared, replaced by the same quiet joy he remembered from years earlier when she first arrived at Ashen Crown. For several long moments he did not move. He simply watched from a respectful distance, realizing that the woman he had traveled so far to find had already begun building a new life without expecting anyone from the old one to follow. And for the first time since beginning his journey, Nathaniel understood that finding Clara would never be the hardest part. Earning the chance to speak to her again would be. The words that mattered most were often spoken only after both hearts had already changed. Nathaniel waited until the two children left the chapel carrying their newly repaired books before quietly stepping through the open wooden doorway. The soft scent of old paper, polished pine, and burning candles filled the peaceful room as evening settled gently across the mountain village. Clara remained seated beside the long oak table, carefully arranging several restored history books into neat stacks without noticing the familiar footsteps approaching across the worn wooden floor. Only when the last book slipped into place did she lift her eyes. Time seemed to pause. Surprise flickered across her face before giving way to quiet composure. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them held 7 years of ordinary mornings, countless unnoticed conversations, and one goodbye that neither had truly understood until it was already behind them. Nathaniel removed his traveling gloves slowly, his voice calm but unmistakably sincere. "Hello, Clara." She offered the same gentle smile she had given palace servants, children, and strangers throughout her life. "Your Majesty." Hearing those formal words somehow hurt more than he expected. They reminded him of the distance he had unknowingly allowed to grow between them long before she ever left the palace. He looked around the modest chapel library where repaired books filled every shelf. Fresh flowers rested beside open windows overlooking the quiet lake, and several handwritten reading lists decorated the walls for village children eager to learn. "You have been busy," he said softly. Clara nodded. There was work that needed to be done. Nathaniel smiled faintly. "I should have known you would find people to help wherever you went." Clara lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Helping people has always made me feel at home." Those simple words carried no accusation. They simply reflected the life she had always chosen. Nathaniel reached carefully into his coat and removed the farewell letter she had never intended him to read. He held it gently rather than offering it back immediately. "I read this." Clara's eyes rested upon the familiar pages before she quietly nodded. "I changed my mind about leaving it behind." "Why?" he asked. She took a slow breath, looking toward the fading sunlight dancing across the chapel floor. "Because I realized it would only place another responsibility upon your shoulders. You already carried enough." Nathaniel felt his heart tighten. Even her goodbye had tried to protect him. He stepped a little closer, stopping at a respectful distance. "I did not come here because of responsibility." Clara looked at him quietly without speaking. Nathaniel continued, every word chosen with care. "I came because I finally understood something I should have understood years ago. I kept thanking people for their work without ever truly seeing the person who made so much of that work possible. I noticed reports, schedules, restored books, solved problems, and peaceful meetings. I never noticed the woman quietly giving pieces of her heart to all of them." Clara listened silently, her expression gentle but unreadable. Nathaniel lowered his gaze for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "I cannot ask you to erase the loneliness you carried while standing only a few steps away from me. I cannot undo the days when you believed your presence made no difference. But I needed you to hear one truth from me before deciding anything about the future." The chapel remained completely still except for the quiet turning of leaves outside the open windows. Nathaniel spoke the words with complete honesty. "I am not asking you to return because the palace needs you. I am asking your forgiveness because I finally understand how deeply I needed you. And I was too blind to recognize it while you were still beside me." Clara's eyes filled gently with tears she did not try to hide, yet for the first time since Nathaniel had found her, those tears carried no heartbreak. They carried the quiet weight of finally being seen. The people who truly changed our lives rarely asked us to choose them. They simply hoped we would notice they had been there all along. The chapel remained peaceful as the last light of evening faded beyond the mountains, painting the quiet lake outside in soft shades of gold and violet. Clara looked at Nathaniel for a long moment before gently wiping away the tears resting upon her cheeks. They were no longer the tears of someone saying goodbye. They were the tears of someone finally hearing the words her heart had waited years to receive. Yet she did not step forward immediately. Some distances could not be crossed in a single conversation, no matter how sincere the apology. She smiled softly, the same gentle smile that had comforted frightened children, encouraged weary servants, and quietly brightened forgotten corners of Ashen Crown Palace for so many years. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathaniel's expression softened with quiet relief, but Clara slowly continued before hope could outrun truth. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for telling me what I needed to hear. But forgiveness and trust are not always rebuilt at the same speed." Nathaniel lowered his head with complete understanding. "I know." Clara walked toward the open chapel doorway where the cool evening breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water across the peaceful village. Children laughed somewhere beyond the nearby cottages while lanterns slowly illuminated narrow stone paths leading toward the lake. She looked across the quiet community that had welcomed her without asking who she had once been. "When I left the palace," she said gently, "I believed I had lost the place I called home. Then I realized something important. Home is not where people need your work. Home is where people truly see your heart." Nathaniel stood beside her, looking across the same peaceful view. "For the first time in many years," he answered. "Not as a king giving promises, but simply as a man speaking honestly. Then I hope one day I can become someone worthy of being part of that home." Clara looked at him with quiet surprise before a small laugh escaped her lips, light and genuine, the first Nathaniel had ever heard from her without the weight of duty surrounding it. "That is a much better beginning than asking me to return." They walked together through the village as evening settled completely over the mountains. Nathaniel greeted every villager who crossed their path with the same respect Clara had always shown them. He listened as she introduced him to the children whose books she had repaired, the elderly couple whose letters she had organized, and the teacher whose classroom she had quietly restored. Watching her among people who appreciated her kindness without taking it for granted, Nathaniel finally understood that love was never proven through grand declarations alone. It was revealed through daily choices, careful attention, and the willingness to truly see another person before it was too late. Several weeks later, Ashen Crown Palace welcomed Clara once again, but not because she had been persuaded to reclaim the life she left behind. She returned on her own terms, continuing her work both at the palace and within the mountain villages she had grown to love. Nathaniel ensured that every member of the royal household, from senior advisors to the newest apprentice, received the same respect Clara had quietly offered everyone else for years. New scholarship programs carried no royal family name. They simply honored anonymous acts of kindness throughout the kingdom. Theodore Bennett smiled as the archives filled once again with quiet purpose, while Samuel the old gardener noticed fresh blue wildflowers blooming beside every palace pathway, reminding lonely travelers that someone had thought of them. And whenever Nathaniel passed Clara in the library or gardens, he never walked by without stopping, smiling, and speaking her name. Because he had learned the lesson that changed not only his heart but his kingdom as well. The greatest goodbyes are not always the ones that end a story. Sometimes they become the reason two people finally begin writing a better one together.